Welcome to the Witnessing Report. This is Hansel and
Jim and
Craig.
This week, Jim went witnessing at the bar on Thursday, and Jim and Craig went downtown Seattle on Friday and met our friend Kirk and set up. To start off this week, Craig, you had some things you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with a nice lady. She came over and handed me paper, and so whenever someone, tries to give us a tract or literature or something like that, I say, oh, we'll swap. And so I gave her a book, and I took her paper, and it was about climate change and the environment. And then so I asked her if she had a Bible, and then I shared the gospel with her, and it was really good. She was listening and seemed interested until the end when she asked me, after I told her the full gospel message, so after I told her, what we could do so we don't have to go to hell, she asked me about if like a 4-year-old or someone who she thought would be innocent made one sin or stole something, if that person would go to hell. And I said, well, yes, because God is just. And you might not like the laws, but it doesn't matter if I like the fact if I go 90 on the freeway, I'll get a ticket. I don't get to determine the laws, so I don't get to determine what God's laws are. And that didn't make her very happy, and so she just kind of walked away.
How about that? Jim, there are things you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I actually had a good night on Thursday night. Talked to a couple people. This one gentleman, a young man, a very sharp guy, and was actually quite eager to talk about these things, about the Bible and about God. And but it was interesting because so he wasn't a fan of God. Didn't believe he existed. But I asked him, because he kept talking about proof. There's no proof. There's proof for all this science. So I called into question that statement, because when it came time I asked him about things like evolution, the Big Bang, and wanting proof. And he actually conceded that there were some things they didn't have proof for. And so I'm like, well, you're willing to believe this stuff without proof. And so I asked him, if the God of the Bible could prove himself to you, and then told you that the stuff in the Bible was true, and I named some of the sins, right? And so, intoxication, profanity, fornication, he really didn't like that God would punish people for that one. And so he had some unflattering things to say about God. And so I told him that obviously proof isn't the issue, because even if you had proof by your own words, you'd still disrespect God. You still wouldn't want to obey God. And so it was interesting because the whole conversation kind of continued along this thread, because he kept bringing up proof. And I kept saying, well, no, proof isn't the reason. We talked about this before. You don't like God's rules. And at one point he even said, in some very colorful language, how he really disliked God's rules and how dare God punish him for breaking his rules. And so it's interesting because that's what it comes down to. People just, they don't want to obey God. They want to do what they want to do. It's their life, type of thing. And it's funny because at the end of the night, there was another young lady who talked to me. And she said she was a Christian, and she took one of the shocking CDs we have, which it turns out to be a good thing, because as we were talking, she didn't like some of God's rules either. And she said, well, we can't be sure that the Bible is true. And then I said, well, then how do you know that you're forgiven? And she paused for a second. She says, well, I know I'm forgiven. I can feel that I'm forgiven. And I'm like, well, what do you base it on? If the Bible isn't true or can't be trusted, how do you know? And it always comes back to this thing, people don't mind the stuff in the Bible about forgiveness, about heaven. It's the obedience part that they can't stand. But I'm hoping I'll get to talk to her again. And the young man actually seemed very eager to talk to me again next week. So that's good. We had a very pleasant conversation, cordial conversation. He seems like a very intelligent young man, and he actually walked away with one of our books. So hopefully God will give us another opportunity to do that. But it's amazing the consistency of this issue. It's just the love of sin that drives people from God. They just love their sins more than God, period.
Yeah, It's interesting how people, they deny God's existence, they say they don't believe in him, yet they're incredibly angry at them. They'll swear at us, they'll swear at God, they'll do anything to get after him. But you don't see people swearing at things like the wolf and Little Red Riding Hood. You don't see them getting angry about fictitious characters. You don't see them getting angry at Santa Claus for not giving them enough presents if they're above the age of 5. People don't get angry at things they don't believe in. And so it's just another proof that God's attributes have been made clear to them through his divine nature. Anything else?
Yeah, there's another person we talked to. He came over, and it was funny because before that we were talking about the multiverse theory, which basically says there's an infinite number of universes, parallel universes, and every time a human being makes a decision or something happens, another universe comes into being what if they had made a different decision? So it's like an infinite number of different ways reality could have happened. And so they exist somewhere out there. And you're talking about how it's such a dumb theory because it's not scientific. There's no way to prove it was right or if it's wrong, and there's no way to observe or test or anything like that. And it was funny because we were talking about that, and then as we said that, somebody came up and we started talking to him, and he first of all, one of the first things he mentioned was this reality, and that there are other realities and other universes out there where stuff could be different. So how do we really know that, we exist, and is time real, and well, maybe God is all these different things? And it was kind of strange to talk to, and it was almost nonsensical. And Jim talked to him for a while there when I went to talk to someone else.
Yeah, and I was listening to Kirk have a majority of the conversation. I think I chimed in a little bit, but I was listening. It was interesting because, as Craig said, there's no proof for these things. The striking thing is that almost in the same breath, people will say, well, there's no proof for God, it's just a fairy tale. And then they'll quote some fairy tale from some guy that's got a PhD after his name and treat it as though it's fact, even though it can't be proven. There's no way to discern this scientifically as even real. But yet they'll believe in this fantasy, but the reality of God that they accuse of being fictitious, they won't have anything to do with. And what's the difference? All these theories, all these man-made fairy tales don't imply any morality or any punishment for behaving in a certain way. But God is very clear. God is holy and perfect and does not like sin and will absolutely judge sin. And people just don't want to hear that. So, I mean, it's the equivalent of a small child, sticking his fingers in his ears and just, trying to ignore what's being said, because they just don't like it. So these people who claim and like to think of themselves as really brilliant people because they're scientific and that somehow, trumps the Bible. They quote these things and believe these things that are absolutely unprovable, but it's comfortable to the conscience. And it lets them fool themselves into believing that they can keep doing what they're doing and not get punished for it. This guy that Kirk was talking to, Kirk asked him, well, what happens if you wind up in hell? And is it possible? And the guy said, well, yeah, there's a possibility that the Bible could be true and I could wind up in hell. But people that usually concede that point really don't believe there's a hell, because they certainly wouldn't feel thrilled about, spending the next 50 years in a maximum security prison, but they just casually go, oh, I could wind up in hell. And so even underneath all the talk and bluster, there's at least a concession on the part of most people that's a distinct possibility, but it's so abhorrent and uncomfortable for them that they still tell themselves that it wouldn't be that bad or it's tolerable. And you always hear people say, well, hell is here on earth. And Craig likes to say, that isn't true. You can have good friends, you can have a good meal, you can have a good day. But in hell, you don't get any of those things. And people trivialize God's justice. And unfortunately for them, that's going to end badly. If God doesn't grant them humility and repentance.
That's very true. Well, that's it for this week. You can email us at twr@jesusforsinners.com. That's again, you can email us at twr@jesusforsinners.com if you have any questions. Thanks. God bless.